The crack came first, sharp and sickening, followed by an explosion of pain so fierce it stole the air from my lungs. The wooden chair had smashed into my ribs with a force that felt like it split me in half, the jagged edge of its impact biting deep into bone. My body folded sideways before I even realized I was falling, and then the floor rose up to meet me with a dull, unforgiving thud. I gasped, but no air came, just a shallow wheeze that scraped my throat. The fire spreading through my side was blinding, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding loud and uneven in my ears. Above me, Melissa stood with her hands still gripping the chair legs, her knuckles white, her breath, heavy eyes glittering with something cruel. "That is what you get for talking back." She spat the words, dripping with contempt. The sound of the chair tipping back onto its legs echoed through the room, an almost lazy clatter that made the violence feel even more deliberate. I tasted blood metallic and hot as it pooled under my tongue. My mother's voice floated from the kitchen, casual and distracted, asking what was going on. Melissa answered nothing, just a little disagreement. My father appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable, his eyes moving over my curled figure on the carpet, as if I were nothing more than a dropped coat. "Get up," he said, flat, no urgency, no concern. The pain was so deep I could barely hear him over the roaring in my head. Every breath stabbed at me from the inside, each movement threatened to snap something else. My vision narrowed until the edges went dark, leaving only the image of Melissa lowering the chair back to the floor like she had just finished rearranging the furniture. The moment fractured months later, I was walking into the courthouse, the echo of my shoes on the tile, steady, deliberate, every step fueled by the memory of that day. In my hands was a manila envelope warm from my grip inside it, the X-rays that showed the clean, unmistakable lines of 2 fractured ribs marked in black ink by the radiologist. I remembered the chair, the look on Melissa's face, the way my father had turned away. The courthouse air was cool, but my skin burned with the memory of humiliation and rage. This time, it would not be buried under excuses or family loyalty. This time, the images would speak for me in the bright, open air of a courtroom. That day, the chair had done more than break bone. It had broken the last tie, binding me to the idea that I owed Melissa my silence. I grew up in a 2-story house on the edge of a small Ohio town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and where the white picket fences tried to hide what went on behind closed doors. My parents, Frank and Janet, prided themselves on appearances, always making sure the lawn was perfect and the curtains matched the seasons. Inside the house, though, there was a different kind of order, one that revolved entirely around my older sister, Melissa. From the moment I was old enough to notice patterns, it was clear she was the sun in our family's small solar system, and I was a distant planet orbiting in the cold. Frank worked long hours at the auto shop and came home with grease still under his nails, but always managed a smile for Melissa. For me, he offered nods, short and brisk, as if acknowledging my presence was enough. Janet was the kind of mother who could turn warmth on and off like a switch, and with Melissa it was always on. She hovered over her, praised her every effort, even the smallest ones. If Melissa drew a crooked heart on a piece of scrap paper, it was framed on the fridge like a masterpiece. When I brought home a perfect spelling test, Janet would glance at it, offer a faint good job, and then turn to see what Melissa was doing. This difference wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was constant, and it sank into me in ways I didn't fully understand until I was much older. At school, I learned to work hard, not for praise, but because it was the only way I could control something in my life. I was the kid who did her homework early, who stayed out of trouble, who tried to be invisible at home, because invisibility seemed safer than competing with Melissa for affection. I would never win. Melissa, on the other hand, thrived on attention. She could be charming when she wanted something and ruthless when she didn't get it. The house bent around her moods. If she was happy, the air felt lighter and my parents relaxed. If she was angry, the tension settled like a heavy fog and everyone adjusted their tone and actions to avoid provoking her further. Frank and Janet saw this as normal family dynamics, just a strong-willed child needing more attention. I saw it as living with a storm cloud that could erupt at any moment. From my earliest memories, there were moments when I thought maybe if I tried hard enough, they would see me too. When I was 7, I spent weeks working on a diorama for the school's history fair, cutting tiny pieces of cardboard painting, miniature furniture, arranging every detail. I won first prize and walked home with my ribbon glowing with pride. Janet took it from my hands, glanced at it, and said, "That's nice," before turning to watch Melissa wobbling down the driveway on her bike without training wheels. I told myself that was a bigger milestone. Riding a bike was something you only learned once. That was how I justified it, how I kept from feeling the sting. But over time, those stings added up until they became a constant ache. The dinners where Melissa dominated the conversation, and my parents laughed at all her stories. The weekends when plans were canceled for me because Melissa needed help with a project or had a minor cold. The quiet understanding that my role was to adapt to her needs while mine were negotiable. That was the backdrop to everything that came later. The reason why, when Melissa's temper flared into violence that day with the chair, it didn't feel like an isolated event. It felt like the inevitable outcome of years of imbalance. Years where she was taught her wants mattered more than my safety. By the time I was a teenager, the pattern was so ingrained it felt like part of the house itself. Like the way the stairs creaked in the same spot, or how the kitchen smelled of coffee every morning. Melissa's dominance and my parents' indulgence had shaped everything. She was older by 2 years and carried that like a badge, using it to justify every order and every insult. If I refused to give her the sweater she wanted to borrow, she would stomp to our parents, declaring I was selfish, and they would scold me for not sharing. If she misplaced something, she claimed I had taken it, and their eyes turned to me first. The imbalance wasn't just emotional, it was physical. I learned early that Melissa's temper had no boundaries. When I was 12, she slammed my bedroom door so hard the mirror fell and shattered because I wouldn't let her read my diary. When I was 14, she shoved me against the kitchen counter during an argument over who would clean the dishes, leaving a bruise on my hip that I hid under long shirts. Each time, Frank and Janet treated it as harmless sibling rivalry. They would tell me to toughen up and not make a big deal out of nothing. Even when she sprained my wrist in high school after twisting my arm behind my back during a fight over the television remote, my parents didn't take me to the doctor. Frank handed me an ice pack and told me it would heal on its own. Their dismissive attitude trained me to swallow my pain and move on. I started avoiding home whenever I could, staying late at the library or hanging out with my friend Laura. She noticed the bruises, but I brushed off her questions, afraid that saying the truth out loud would make it harder to keep enduring it. Melissa thrived in high school, not academically but socially. She was the queen bee with a circle of friends who followed her lead. My parents attended every cheerleading competition and every event she was part of, while my debate tournaments and science fairs were lucky to get a single text of good luck. Even graduation was a split scene. When I walked across the stage to receive my honor roll certificate, they clapped politely, but Melissa's minor role in the senior play got a standing ovation from them as if she were Broadway material. In college, I thought distance might break the pattern, but it only changed the way it played out. When I got an internship out of state, Melissa called me to complain that I had taken the opportunity away from her, even though she had never applied. Frank and Janet called me later that night, asking if I could send her money since she was between jobs. I said no, and the coldness in their voices lingered for months. After I graduated and moved into my own small apartment, I kept my contact with them minimal. But Melissa's reach was long. She showed up at my door uninvited, asking for a place to stay after a breakup. I let her sleep on the couch for a week, thinking maybe this was a chance to reset things. Instead, she rifled through my kitchen, leaving dishes piled high, and borrowed my coat without asking, returning it with a tear in the sleeve. When I told her she needed to leave, she stormed out and called my parents, spinning a story about how I had thrown her out into the cold with nowhere to go. Frank's voice on the phone was icy, accusing me of cruelty and selfishness. That was the moment I realized that no matter what I did in their eyes, Melissa would always be the one worth protecting. It was this history that formed the foundation for everything that happened later. When I think back to the day of the chair, it's impossible to separate it from the years of small, unacknowledged injuries that came before. The slammed doors, the bruises, the dismissive comments were all bricks in the wall that trapped me in a role I never asked for. That day wasn't a sudden eruption. It was the culmination of years of being told my pain was insignificant and my safety was negotiable. It was the point where Melissa's learned belief that she could do anything to me without consequence met my body in the form of splintering wood and snapping bone, and my parents' immediate instinct to minimize it was not a new reaction, but the same pattern just applied to something too big to ignore. For them, ignoring it was easier than facing the truth about who Melissa was and what they had allowed her to become. The spark that lit the fuse came months before the chair ever touched my ribs. I had finally saved enough for a down payment on a modest 2-bedroom condo on the edge of town. It was the first thing in my life that was entirely mine, bought with money I earned through years of careful budgeting and extra shifts. The moment I told my parents, they were lukewarm congratulatory, but when Melissa found out, her reaction was instant and entitled. She called me the next day saying she needed a place to stay for a while since her lease was ending and she didn't want to be tied down with another rental. Her tone made it sound less like a request and more like an announcement. I told her gently that I had plans for the second bedroom as a workspace and guest room, but she could visit any time. She went quiet, then cold, before hanging up. 2 days later, Frank called me saying Melissa was stressed and that letting her stay with me would help her get back on her feet. I repeated my answer and felt the shift in his voice from persuasion to disappointment. Over the next few weeks, the tension built in small ways. Melissa began posting vague comments on social media about selfish people who didn't understand family loyalty. Janet started making little digs during phone calls about how it must be nice to have so much space to yourself. It was clear they were talking about me, and clear they expected me to give in. I held my ground, thinking the storm would pass, but it only gathered strength. Melissa showed up unannounced one Saturday with a suitcase in hand, expecting to move in. I told her firmly that I couldn't accommodate her long term, and she left with a glare that promised this wasn't over. Over the next month, family dinners became more strained. Melissa would bring up my condo in front of relatives, making jokes about how I had a whole room just gathering dust while she was struggling. My parents would laugh along and glance at me as if daring me to contradict her. I stopped attending as often, but when Janet invited me to her birthday dinner, I agreed partly out of obligation, partly to avoid giving them more ammunition. That night, I walked into the familiar dining room to find Melissa already seated at the head of the table, chatting and smiling like she owned the place. The meal began politely enough, but I could feel the tension simmering under the surface. Halfway through dessert, Melissa turned the conversation toward my condo again. She said it was ridiculous that I was hoarding space and that in any real family people shared what they had. I replied calmly that I had worked hard for my home and had the right to decide who lived there. Her smile vanished, replaced by the hard, flat look I knew too well. The room went quiet, except for the faint clink of Janet's fork against her plate. Melissa's voice dropped low and sharp, accusing me of caring more about my things than my own sister. I felt the weight of my parents' eyes on me, waiting for me to back down, but I held my ground. The air felt thick with the old dynamic, the expectation that I would yield. Instead, I said plainly that I was not responsible for fixing her life and I would not be bullied into it. That was the moment I saw her hands tighten on the arms of her chair and her jaw clench. She pushed back from the table slowly, then stood up. My parents stayed seated silent, as if frozen in their roles. I thought she might storm out, but instead, she stepped toward me, the flicker of rage fully visible now. I had just enough time to register the movement before she reached for the nearest wooden dining chair and lifted it. The sound of it scraping over the floor was a prelude to the blow that would come minutes later. The fuse was lit. I just didn't know how quickly it would burn down. The night of my mother's birthday started with an uneasy truce, but it shattered in an instant. After Melissa stood from the table with that heavy chair in her hands, there was a moment where time seemed to slow down enough for me to see every detail. Her knuckles were pale from gripping the wood, her eyes narrowed to slits, her breathing quick and shallow. I remember opening my mouth to tell her to put it down, but before I could form the words, she swung. The first point of contact was a deep, blunt force into my left side, a crack that I felt as much as I heard. The pain was instant white hot and radiating outward, stealing my breath like a punch to the lungs. My knees buckled and I went down hard onto the carpet, my arms wrapping around my ribs in a desperate instinct to protect what had already been broken. The chair clattered to the floor beside me, and for a second the room was filled with the sound of my ragged gasps. My vision blurred at the edges as I fought to inhale enough air. Melissa's shadow loomed over me and her voice came low and cold. "That's what you get for talking back." I could taste blood, sharp and metallic, and every shallow breath sent a stab of pain through my chest. I looked toward my parents, expecting shock or concern, but Frank was still in his chair, arms crossed, his jaw tight, not in anger at her, but at me. Janet sat frozen, her eyes darting between us like she was calculating whether this scene was worth acknowledging. "Call an ambulance," I managed to wheeze, but Frank shook his head and said, "You'll be fine. Stop being dramatic." The absurdity of those words in that moment almost outweighed the pain, but then another wave of it hit and I could barely think. I tried to shift into a sitting position and the movement sent lightning through my side. Janet finally stood and muttered, "I guess we should take her to urgent care." Frank got up without a word and helped me to my feet, but his grip was perfunctory, as if he were guiding a stranger. Melissa had already sat back down picking at her cake like nothing had happened. The drive to the hospital was silent except for my occasional hiss of pain when the car hit a bump. At urgent care, the nurse's eyes widened when she saw the bruising already spreading across my ribs. She ordered x-rays immediately, and when the doctor came in with the results, his tone was clinical but firm. "2 fractures on the left side. You'll need several weeks to heal, and you're lucky the lung wasn't punctured." He asked how it happened, and I told him the truth. He glanced at Frank and Janet, but neither of them said a word. The nurse asked if I wanted to file a report with the police, and I hesitated, feeling the weight of every past incident pressing down on me. Frank's voice cut in, saying, "No report is necessary. It was an accident." My eyes locked with the nurse's, and I saw in her expression that she didn't buy it, but she wrote her notes and left. They wrapped my ribs, prescribed pain medication, and gave me a list of follow-up appointments. Back at the house, Frank dropped me at the curb with a terse, "Take care of yourself." Melissa never looked up from her phone as I limped past her to get my bag and leave. The ride home in a cab was a blur of streetlights and throbbing pain. Alone in my apartment later that night, I replayed the scene over and over. The way she lifted the chair, the cold satisfaction in her voice, the emptiness in my parents' eyes. It was the culmination of years of being treated as an afterthought, and I knew something inside me had shifted. The physical pain was sharp and immediate, but underneath it was something colder and more permanent, the knowledge that if I stayed silent again, I was telling them all they could do this to me without consequence. As I lay in bed, propped up by pillows to ease the pressure on my ribs, I could feel the slow building resolve. This time, I would not let it slide into the long archive of unspoken injuries. This time, there would be a record. This time, there would be consequences. The next morning, the bruises had darkened into deep shades of purple and black, spreading across my side like an ugly map of what Melissa had done. Every movement was a reminder, a sharp pulse of pain that made even breathing feel like work. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, thinking about how many times I had woken up hurting because of her, and how many times I had convinced myself it wasn't worth making a scene. But the chair had changed something. It wasn't a shove in passing or a slap during an argument. It was calculated force meant to hurt, and my ribs were the proof. I picked up my phone and called Laura, my closest friend since high school. The concern in her voice was immediate. She came over within an hour, bringing groceries and a stack of easy-to-heat meals. When she saw the bruising, her jaw tightened. "This isn't just an argument, Sarah," she said quietly. "This is assault." She asked if I had the medical records yet, and I told her they had given me a copy at urgent care along with the x-rays. She told me to keep everything together in one place and take photos of my injuries every day to document the healing process. I felt a strange mix of gratitude and shame. Gratitude because she was here and on my side. Shame because a part of me still wondered if I was overreacting just like my parents always told me I did. Laura seemed to read my thoughts. "You are not exaggerating. This is serious and you know it." That night I scrolled through Ohio's assault laws, reading about how serious bodily harm could elevate a charge to felony assault. 2 broken ribs qualified. The more I read, the more I realized how much I had let them all convince me my safety wasn't worth fighting for. I thought about calling my parents, but I knew the conversation would go in circles. They would defend Melissa. They would tell me I provoked her, and they would try to wear me down until I dropped it. I also thought about the way Frank had dismissed me at the clinic and the way Janet had hesitated before even suggesting urgent care. That wasn't protection. That was damage control for the family image. I decided to call a lawyer instead. Laura found one through a friend who specialized in domestic assault cases. His name was Peter, and he agreed to meet me the following week. In the meantime, Laura checked in daily, and a neighbor helped carry groceries up to my second-floor apartment. Their care only highlighted the contrast with my family's absence. Not a single call from Frank or Janet. Not a single text from Melissa. I suspected they were all waiting for me to just get over it. But as I sat with the slow ache in my side and the stack of evidence on my kitchen table, I knew I wasn't going to. This wasn't going to fade into another invisible scar. This time, I was going to make sure it left a mark on them too. Meeting Peter was different from what I expected. I thought I would feel small in his office, like I was asking for too much, but instead he made it clear from the start that what happened to me was criminal and not some petty sibling dispute. He listened without interrupting while I told him everything from the tension over my condo to the moment the chair hit my ribs. When I finished, he asked to see the photos and medical records. His eyes narrowed when he saw the x-rays showing the clean fracture lines. "This isn't just assault," he said. "This is aggravated assault with intent to cause serious harm." He explained that because it happened in a domestic setting, the court could classify it under domestic violence statutes, which carried harsher penalties. I felt a strange surge of validation and fear at the same time. Peter asked if I was ready for the fallout. He said cases like this often brought out the worst in families. People picked sides, and sometimes the victim became the target all over again. I told him I had already been living that reality for years. He nodded and said we would start with filing a police report backed by the medical evidence and witness testimony from anyone willing to speak up. The thought of going to the police made my stomach knot, but Peter assured me he would handle the legal framing. My job was to tell the truth exactly as it happened. When we left his office, the air felt lighter, like I had just stepped out from under a weight I didn't realize I was carrying. The next day, Laura drove me to the station. The officer who took my statement read through Peter's prepared summary, then listened while I described the attack in my own words. He didn't rush me, didn't smirk or sigh like Frank always did when I tried to explain something painful. He just wrote it all down and asked if I wanted to press charges. I said yes without hesitation. That single word felt like reclaiming something I had lost years ago. Peter moved quickly after that. He filed for a protective order and notified the court that we intended to pursue charges. Within a week, Melissa was served with a summons. I heard through a cousin that she exploded when she read it, screaming that I was destroying the family. Janet called once, leaving a voicemail about how ashamed she was that I would air private family matters in public. I didn't call back. Frank sent a text saying I needed to think about the long-term consequences. I ignored it too. The truth was, I had already thought about the long term, and I decided I would rather be estranged from them than keep living as their silent punching bag. Peter began preparing me for the possibility of testifying. He said Melissa's lawyer would try to paint me as overdramatic or imply that the injury was an accident. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror practicing saying, "She broke my ribs with a chair, and I have the x-rays to prove it." I said it until my voice didn't shake. In the quiet of my apartment, I realized I wasn't just building a legal case. I was building a version of myself that my family couldn't touch. The more I prepared, the more I could see the path ahead. It wouldn't be easy, but the end was no longer a blur. It was a courtroom, and Melissa would have to look at the evidence and know that this time the truth wasn't going away. The weeks leading up to the court date were a mix of quiet tension and bursts of adrenaline every time my phone buzzed. Laura kept me grounded, reminding me to eat and rest, while Peter drilled me on possible cross-examination questions. He told me Melissa's attorney might try to twist my words or bring up old unrelated arguments to make me look unstable. We rehearsed calmly, countering with facts. Every time I stumbled, Peter would pause and say, "Remember, the truth is your anchor. You lived it. Nobody can take that away." I printed extra copies of my medical records and stored the original X-rays in a protective sleeve. Sometimes I would take them out and just look at the stark white lines on the dark film, a physical map of pain and proof. In a strange way, they felt like armor. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. My ribs still ached in the cold, and my mind kept replaying that moment, the wooden chair lifting off the ground and crashing into my side, the way Melissa's face looked not in rage, but in cold satisfaction. I woke before sunrise dressed in a navy blazer and simple blouse, then sat at my kitchen table staring at the cup of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink. When Laura arrived to drive me, she gave my shoulder a squeeze and said, "Let's go get your justice." The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and coffee, with a hum of voices echoing off the high ceilings. We checked in and took seats near the front. Melissa walked in 20 minutes later, wearing a smug half-smile flanked by my parents. Janet avoided my eyes. Frank gave me a look that was somewhere between disappointment and warning. I felt a flicker of the old fear, but Peter leaned over and whispered, "They're not in control here. You are." The bailiff called our case and we moved to the front. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, asked if we were ready to proceed. Peter presented our evidence, starting with the X-rays. The moment the images lit up on the screen, there was a visible shift in the room. Even Melissa's smirk faltered. Peter explained the nature of the fractures, citing the medical report and testimony from the urgent care physician. He described the force required to cause such injuries, linking it to my account of the assault. When it was my turn to speak, I took a deep breath and told the story without embellishment. I kept my voice steady, focusing on the truth. I could feel Melissa's glare burning into me, but I didn't look her way. Then came the cross-examination. As predicted, her lawyer tried to suggest the injury happened in another way, perhaps from a fall or accident. I held my ground, repeating that I was standing in my living room when Melissa lifted the chair and struck me. He tried to imply I had exaggerated in the past about minor conflicts. Peter objected, and the judge sustained it. I felt a small spark of triumph. After both sides presented their closing statements, the judge announced she would review the evidence and issue a decision the following week. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt drained, but lighter. Laura hugged me tightly. Peter told me I had done exactly what I needed to. We drove home in silence, the weight of years of silence and pain, feeling just a little less suffocating. This time, it wasn't just my word against hers. It was my word backed by proof, and that changed everything. The week between the hearing and the verdict felt longer than any month I had ever lived. Each day, I tried to focus on small tasks, laundry, cooking, short walks down the block, but the thought of the judge reviewing those X-rays and my testimony was never far from my mind. I replayed the expressions I had seen in court, Melissa's forced composure cracking when the images appeared, Frank's jaw tightening, Janet's eyes darting away. I wondered if they were starting to realize that this time their version of events wouldn't control the narrative. Peter called me 2 days before the scheduled verdict to say the judge had requested additional clarification from the medical expert, which was normal, but it made my stomach churn. Laura reminded me that the more thorough the review, the stronger the verdict would be if it came in my favor. On the morning of the decision, I dressed the same way I had for the hearing. Simple and neat, nothing that could be twisted into a performance. Laura drove me again, both of us quiet, but her hand resting on the console between us like an unspoken promise. The courthouse felt heavier this time, as though the walls were holding the weight of all the unspoken things that had been allowed to fester for years. When Melissa walked in, she looked less sure of herself, her parents close on either side, but not speaking. We took our seats and waited as the judge entered and called the court to order. She began by summarizing the case, outlining the evidence presented and the legal standard for assault causing serious bodily harm. My heart thudded in my chest with each point she recapped. Then she looked directly at Melissa and said, "The court finds that the evidence proves beyond a reasonable doubt that you did intentionally strike your sister Sarah with a chair, causing 2 fractured ribs." The air in the room seemed to shift. Melissa's face went pale, and Frank muttered something under his breath. The judge continued sentencing Melissa to community service fines and a restraining order prohibiting her from contacting me for 3 years. It wasn't jail time, but it was public and official, a mark on her record that she couldn't erase. As soon as the gavel came down, Laura squeezed my hand hard. I felt an odd mixture of relief and vindication, not because I wanted to see my sister punished for the sake of it, but because for once the truth had been seen and acknowledged. Outside the courthouse, reporters covering unrelated cases milled about, and one of them asked if I wanted to comment. I simply said, "Sometimes you have to stand up, even if it means standing alone," then walked away. In the days that followed, word of the case spread through our small town. People who had known us for years looked at me differently now, not with pity, but with a kind of respect. Some even reached out quietly to share their own stories of family violence hidden behind closed doors. My parents stayed silent, no calls, no visits, and no apology. Melissa disappeared from social media. I knew there would be fallout, whispered conversations, and cold shoulders, but I also knew I had shifted something in the balance. I had proof I had spoken and the law had listened. That night, I put the x-rays back in their sleeve and stored them in a box in my closet. Not because I needed the reminder, but because they had become a symbol. They were the moment I stopped letting my family rewrite my reality and started telling my own story on my own terms. In the weeks after the verdict, life began to take on a different rhythm, one that didn't revolve around waiting for the next blow, literal or verbal, from my family. The absence of their voices was at first strange, then liberating. No more late-night texts from Janet reminding me to keep the peace. No more sarcastic comments from Frank about my so-called victim act. No more sudden visits from Melissa to stir trouble. Instead, I filled the space with people who had proven themselves worthy of it. Laura, who still dropped by with coffee every other morning, my neighbor Mrs. Dawson, who invited me to her Sunday dinners, and even a few co-workers who had quietly cheered me on during the court process. I began sleeping better without the constant undercurrent of dread. My ribs healed slowly, the tenderness fading, but not gone entirely, a physical echo of what had happened. I kept up with my therapy sessions twice a week, pouring years of buried hurt into the open. It was hard work excavating the layers of guilt and self-doubt that had built up since childhood, but for the first time I wasn't doing it to fix myself for them. I was doing it for me. The restraining order meant Melissa couldn't come near me, and knowing there was legal backing to that boundary gave me a sense of safety I hadn't felt in years. Of course, the silence from my family wasn't complete. Word filtered back through mutual acquaintances that Frank and Janet were telling anyone who would listen that I had blown things out of proportion to get attention. I didn't bother responding. The verdict spoke louder than any denial they could spin. Melissa apparently tried to find a job in town, but the combination of her temper and her record made it difficult. I didn't rejoice in her struggles, but I also didn't feel responsible for fixing them. She had chosen her path the same way I was now choosing mine. One evening in early spring, Laura and I sat on my porch watching the sun dip behind the houses, and she asked if I felt like it had all been worth it. I thought about the hospital lights, the cold indifference in my parents' eyes, the moment in court when the judge read the verdict, and my sister's expression crumpled. "Yes," I said quietly, "it was worth it." That night, I opened my laptop and began writing down everything from the night of the chair to the last day in court. At first, it was just for me a way to make sense of it all, but as the pages filled, I realized I was creating something more. A record, a story. Not the one my family told, but the one I lived. Laura encouraged me to share it somewhere, and after some hesitation, I submitted it to a domestic violence awareness blog under a pseudonym. Weeks later, the piece was published and the responses poured in. People wrote to say they saw themselves in my words, that my story had given them the push to speak out or leave a dangerous situation. Some simply said thank you. Each message was a reminder that speaking up wasn't just about justice in my own life. It was about shining a light for others still in the dark. The bruises had faded, but the lines of strength etched into me were deeper now and unshakable. On the 1-year anniversary of the attack, I drove to the courthouse not for a hearing, but to stand outside and remember. I took a deep breath, feeling the spring air in my lungs without the sharp ache of broken ribs, and I let the memory settle, not as a wound, but as proof. Proof that no matter how hard they had tried to keep me small, I had stood up. Proof that I had walked into that courtroom with my evidence, my truth, and my voice, and left with all of them intact. As I turned to leave, I realized I no longer needed the x-rays in my closet as a shield. I had become my own. Months passed, and the distance from my family that once felt like a gaping wound began to feel like a protective wall I had built myself brick by brick. The noise of their constant criticism and manipulation had been replaced with quiet evenings spent reading on the couch or tending to the little garden I'd planted out back. The tomatoes were coming in nicely, a small but satisfying reminder that when you nurture something, it grows strong instead of rotting under neglect. I didn't have to brace myself for the sound of my phone buzzing anymore, because the people who had my number now were the ones who used it to check on me, not to tear me down. Melissa's presence in town had dwindled after the court case. I heard she moved 2 counties over to live with an old friend, though the rumor mill also said she was keeping her head down because too many people knew what she'd done. Frank and Janet still had their circle of sympathizers, but their reach had shrunk without me in it, and their version of events didn't hold up as well without me around to absorb their lies in silence. I focused on my own work, taking on more hours at the library, and eventually being offered a promotion to branch coordinator. The raise meant I could finally replace the old couch Melissa had once slashed in a fit of rage years ago. I sold the couch for next to nothing and watched the buyers haul it away with a sense of finality that was sweeter than I expected. My therapist called it reclaiming my space, and she was right. Every change I made in my home, from the fresh coat of paint in the hallway to the new lock on the front door, felt like a declaration that this was my life now, and they no longer had keys to it. The legal part of things was settled, but the emotional work was still ongoing. There were days when I woke up from dreams where I was back in that living room, the chair above me, Melissa's shadow falling across my face. Those mornings I took extra time to ground myself, touching the scar on my side where one rib had healed a little uneven. I reminded myself that the scar was not a weakness, but a mark of survival. The blog post I had written months ago continued to circulate, popping up in online forums and even being quoted in a community workshop flyer about recognizing early signs of abuse. One afternoon, I received an email from a woman in her 60s who said my story had made her leave her husband after 40 years of emotional and physical harm. She wrote that she wished she'd had my courage decades earlier, but was grateful to have it now. I sat with that email for a long time, my hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that what I had endured and spoken about had shifted someone else's life. It was proof that the ripple effect was real, that telling the truth could be an act of resistance not just for myself, but for others. By the time summer rolled around, I realized I hadn't thought about revenge in months. What I had now was better than revenge. It was peace. It was the ability to walk through my front door without flinching to sleep, without listening for footsteps in the hallway, to wake up without dread curling in my stomach. I had walked into court with x-rays once, but I was walking into the rest of my life with something far stronger. My own voice, my own safety, and the unshakable knowledge that I would never let them break me again. Looking back, I could see every step that had brought me to that moment in the courthouse as if they were laid out in a straight, unbroken line. It began with a lifetime of small cruelties, moments I used to brush off as family tension, but which now stood out in sharp relief. Melissa's sharp tongue, my father's dismissive snorts, my mother's selective blindness, all of it had worked together to keep me small and compliant. The chair to my ribs had just been the loudest and most public crack in a foundation that had been rotting for years. The court case had exposed that rot for everyone to see, not just in my family, but in the wider community. I had braced myself for whispers and sideways looks, but what came instead was an outpouring of support from people I never expected to care. A retired teacher from my high school stopped me in the grocery store to say she remembered the bruises I'd tried to hide under long sleeves and wished she'd spoken up sooner. A neighbor I barely knew left a bouquet of lilies on my porch with a note that simply read, "You didn't deserve any of it." Even the local paper ran a small piece about the importance of documenting domestic violence cases, quoting my lawyer about the role the x-rays had played. In that moment, I understood something vital. The truth once made visible has a power that no amount of denial can erase. My family could twist the story for themselves all they wanted, but those images were burned into the public record. That permanence mattered. It meant the abuse wasn't just a shadow in my memory. It was a fact that could not be buried or explained away. Walking away from the courthouse that day, I didn't feel triumphant exactly, but I felt solid, like the ground beneath me was finally steady. I knew there would be more work ahead, more healing, more boundaries to draw and enforce. But I also knew I'd done something irreversible. I had pulled the curtain back and shown the world what had been hiding in my living room for years, and once you do that, there is no going back to silence. That knowledge settled into me like armor, and I carried it forward into every new day, determined never to let anyone take my voice or my truth from me again. Months later, the physical ache in my ribs had faded, but the memory of that chair slamming into me had not. I had moved into a small sunlit apartment on the other side of town where no one knew my last name unless I chose to tell them. The quiet was strange at first, but it became a kind of medicine, letting me rebuild routines that belonged only to me. Melissa was now living with the weight of a criminal record and the restrictions that came with probation. I had seen her once from across the street outside the courthouse, her posture smaller, her eyes darting around like she expected someone to be watching. She didn't see me, and I didn't call out. There was nothing left to say. My parents had tried to reach out twice, first with a short email that skipped over the assault entirely, and second with a card at Christmas signed without love. Both times I threw the messages away without responding. I wasn't interested in half apologies or their version of family unity that required me to keep swallowing harm. My lawyer had closed the case file, but he kept the x-rays and photographs in his archive just in case. Knowing they existed somewhere outside my control oddly comforted me. It meant that even if I decided to walk away entirely, the truth could still speak without me. Laura visited often, and we laughed more than I thought possible after the year I'd had. Sometimes she would catch me staring out the window lost in thought, and she'd remind me, "You did the right thing, Sarah. You stopped pretending." And she was right. For years I had been taught that loyalty to family was about silence, about absorbing whatever they gave without protest. Breaking that silence had been terrifying, but it had also been the most freeing act of my life. As winter melted into spring, I planted flowers in mismatched pots on my balcony, watching them take root and stretch toward the sun. They grew slowly but steadily, just like me. And one morning I realized I no longer thought of the chair first when I walked into my living room. Instead, I thought about the sunlight on my plants and the sound of my own laughter echoing back from the walls. Justice had been served, but more than that, I had reclaimed my life and I wasn't giving it back.